Hey there guys, we're taking a look at Assassin's Creed Revelations running on the i5-1135G7. Now this is currently running at 1080p with what the game decided to default the graphics settings to. It seemed very interesting, so I decided to give it a go. Because the game defaulted to a mix of medium and low, or rather medium and high settings, and the performance was not as bad as I was expecting it to be, in all honesty, but it's not great. Specifically, the 1% lows are brutal. But that seems to be a common problem with 1080p in general, at least in certain aspects. Specifically, and the reason the 1% lows are really rough here is because of cutscenes. When you load into a cutscene, it's going to cause the 1% lows to drop dramatically, and it can get to the point where you actually can't even really fully experience what's going on in the cutscene, because you might hear the audio, but then the video itself is like actually not synced up, the animations won't load in properly. You know, like it can get pretty brutal to the point where if you just want to play the game for the gameplay only, you can get away with this. But if you're playing it because you enjoy the story of these games, then you're going to have to turn down the settings. And you're going to have to turn them down pretty dramatically. Dropping things down to the lowest settings does improve the 1% lows slightly, but it's still not a big enough improvement. Again, for the most part, the gameplay is going to be perfectly fine. You're not really going to notice too bad of an experience actually playing the game, but it's when you want to actually experience the story and all that you're going to run into major issues. Because again, it's those cutscenes that really just bring things down super bad. And for sure, it's not just the fact that you're going to have, you know, bad 1% lows in like, you know, the gameplay, you know, that's pretty much alleviated by setting everything to low, but those cutscenes still just struggle. But it's a noticeable enough improvement over 1080p with whatever defaulted the graphics settings to that I think it is worth at least playing like this if you care about, you know, playing at 1080p. And again, it's just the gameplay that you care about. You don't really care about the story, which I would not blame you for wanting to skip, because this is one of those series where you either love it or you hate it, you know? Specifically the Ezio trilogy. Some people absolutely love it. Others really didn't like the direction the story went. Personally, I think the whole like kind of alien thing really did sour a lot of the experience of it. But for the most part, you know, I don't think that the story itself is necessarily bad, although I think the ending kind of is. So if you're just willing to ignore all of that and you just want to enjoy the gameplay, you can go right ahead and do that at 1080p with the lowest settings. If you want to go with what the game defaulted to here, you can, but just know you're going to experience some 1% lows that might sour the experience. But I get the feeling that a lot of Assassin's Creed fans are used to the games running less than stellar. But jumping on over to 720p at the default game settings, the performance is actually a little better in terms of averages, but those 1% lows are still present, and you're going to notice those stutters here and there. Now, they're very infrequent, and I feel like it's still not going to affect gameplay for the most part, but cutscenes are going to continue to suffer. But really, those 1% lows are just a little misleading because for the most part, the gameplay is going to be relatively smooth most of the time that you're playing. There will be occasionally moments where the gameplay itself will be what stutters, but most of the time it's going to be new areas loading in, or you're loading into a cutscene, things like that, or you're going into a transition, or you're just loading in a new animation, things like that that end up, you know, causing a stutter here and there. But it's usually in situations where you would not realistically notice it, but there will be those moments where you might get into a cutscene and suddenly a scene that you're trying to look at will not render properly because it's just struggling to keep up. So it can be an inconsistent and dodgy experience, but for the most part, it is playable, and it seems to be an issue that occurs no matter what you really set the graphics settings to. Besides, setting things to low is like the only way to alleviate most of the problems, but they don't fully go away. And I think it's perfectly fine that you can get away with playing the game like this. As long as it's not interrupting the gameplay, you're perfectly fine. Honestly, if I launched this game and just left the settings to their default at 1080p and didn't even have an FPS counter, I would probably have a pretty good time. So I would say that really this game, unless you are really sensitive to 1% low or low 1% lows, you know, if you're someone that really notices stutter and things like that, I would recommend that you then, you know, just lower the settings to the lowest possible at 1080p. I wouldn't really bother with 720p for the most part, unless you're trying to go for that above 60 FPS experience for a lot of the time. But even then, those 1% lows will drag you down. I mean, right now they look perfectly fine, but once we get into another region, things might start to load in a little bit. They might drop a little bit, but again, that's not gameplay, you know, that's just like a transition. It's a cutscene, you know, and like as long as it doesn't ruin the cutscene, which to be fair, sometimes the cutscenes do get ruined, you're going to be able to play the game perfectly fine. So what I would say is that this game is playable for the most part, you know, at pretty much 1080p or 720p at the default graphics or the low graphics, doesn't really matter. It's going to be mostly playable, but situations like this, what you're seeing right now, this cutscene, is a perfect example of where the issues really start to arise, and setting the settings to pretty much anything is not going to alleviate it a lot of the time. I think setting the graphics to the lowest would have at least let that play out a lot smoother than that, but it still would have had some pretty low 1% lows. But that one was absolutely brutal. And it is a frequent enough occurrence that, again, if you care about the story, you're not really going to be able to do that too well here. But if you just care about the gameplay itself is running perfectly smooth. You know, I mean, we're getting an average of 71 right now for what we're doing here, where we're actually playing the game. We're not just looking at it. So really, it all just comes down to what you're willing to tolerate. But anyways, I appreciate you guys watching. I hope you found this video helpful. Be sure to subscribe if you did, and I will see you guys next time.